Welcome to Just Johnny and Sophie. I want you to imagine just clicking a link, right?
Oh, yeah. Just a normal work day.
Exactly. A totally normal day. You click a link, you turn on your camera, and suddenly you realize you are staring at a grid of like 15 executives.
Right. And they're from a completely different company.
Yes, a totally different company. So, do you immediately hit the leave button?
Which is what any sane person would do.
Right. Or do you just sit there in silence for 20 full minutes and accidentally become their top consultant?
It is still so wild to me.
It's honestly legendary. Today, we are opening up our personal archives to explore this piece of absolute lore involving our friend Dan. We call this story The Accidental Consultant.
Such a good title.
Right. And we're going to use Dan's little adventure to sort of unpack this fascinating psychological concept.
Yeah, we're looking at how absolute unbothered confidence it can literally bend reality.
It really is a phenomenal case study. Because, when you first hear what Dan did, your brain just kind of rejects the premise entirely.
Yeah, you just think, well, there's no way this happens in real life.
Exactly. You assume somebody would flag the stranger in the room. Or at the very least, the stranger would just panic and close the window.
Right. But the reality of how this actually unfolded with Dan, it just reveals so much about these crazy blind spots in human perception.
Oh, completely.
It touches on the evolutionary biology of the freeze response and just the truly bizarre power of corporate jargon.
So true. So let's get right into the anatomy of this mistake, because we really have to look at how a totally mundane day transformed into this like unintentional undercover operation.
Right. Set the scenes for us.
Okay, so Dan had 3 back-to-back online meetings scheduled that day. And if you work from home, you know exactly what that kind of remote work fatigue feels like.
Oh, absolutely.
Your calendar is just this solid wall of blocks. The meeting links all look like these identical strings of blue text, and your brain is it's essentially on autopilot.
Which is the perfect breeding ground for, a low-stakes cognitive error. So Dan just clicks the wrong link.
Literally just a misclick.
Right. It's an incredibly common, totally harmless mistake. The camera connects, the audio chimes in, and suddenly he is face-to-face with an entire department of people who work for a completely different organization.
He doesn't recognize a single face on the screen.
Not one.
Yeah.
And here is the critical data point for our whole discussion today. Dan noticed it immediately.
He knew right away.
Exactly. The second the screen populated, he knew he had made a mistake.
But he didn't leave.
No, he didn't.
And this is where my mind just completely breaks. Like, why not? You realize you walked into the wrong room, you just turn around and walk out, right?
You would think so.
But Dan makes this conscious, deeply bizarre choice to just sit there quietly and pretend everything is totally normal.
Yeah, he just settles in.
I keep trying to map this onto, like, physical space. It's like walking into the wrong movie theater, realizing it immediately, but deciding to just sit down and eat your popcorn anyway.
That is exactly what it's like.
But why? Like, I have to push you on this. Why do human beings do this? Why is the social friction of saying, oops, wrong room, somehow scarier than sitting through a stranger's corporate meeting?
Well, it's actually like evolutionary camouflage.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Think about it. If a prey animal realizes it accidentally wandered into a den of predators, its first instinct isn't to make a sudden loud movement to draw attention to itself.
Oh, right.
Its instinct is to stay completely motionless and just blend in. It's a perfect mechanical analogy for what Dan's brain was doing.
So his brain just froze.
Exactly. What you're seeing is the amygdala completely hijacking the prefrontal cortex.
Okay, unpack that a little bit for me.
So the prefrontal cortex, that's the logical reasoning part of your brain.
Yeah.
It knows that the easiest solution is to just move your mouse and click leave.
Right. It literally takes half a second.
Exactly. But the amygdala, which processes fear and threat, perceives this sudden social exposure as a massive, immediate danger.
Wait, I have to push back on that. A massive danger.
Yes.
It's a meeting with, like, mid-level managers in cardigans. Nobody is getting eaten here. Why on earth does the brain treat a minor social faux pas like a literal physical threat?
Because to the primitive parts of our brain, social friction is a physical threat.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, for early humans, being ostracized or looking foolish or disrupting the social order of the group, that could literally mean exile. And exile meant death.
So his brain is basically fighting for survival on a Zoom call.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
In that split second, Dan's brain calculates the immediate social friction. If he speaks up, he interrupts someone's presentation.
He forces 15 strangers to look right at him.
Right. He has to stutter through this awkward apology. So the brain just does the math and decides that freezing, just absolute silence, is the path of least immediate resistance.
Wow. So he just lets the momentum of the meeting carry him forward because stopping the train just feels way too painful?
Exactly.
He's just sitting there, probably monitoring his own breathing, hoping the lighting in his room doesn't look too suspicious.
Just trying to be invisible.
But staying completely motionless only works for a few minutes. And this is where the dynamic really shifts in the story.
Yeah, it definitely escalates.
The situation goes from this passive freeze response to active, high-stakes participation.
The psychological inertia here is just fascinating to me. Once Dan has been sitting there for like 5 minutes, leaving suddenly becomes so much harder.
For sure. Because to leave now raises the question of why he was silently lurking in the first place.
Right. So he commits to the bit. The team in the meeting starts projecting this slide deck of quarterly sales numbers.
And Dan starts listening.
He is actively listening.
To the proprietary data of a completely random company. He has zero stake in these numbers, but he's, nodding, tracking the charts, absorbing the metrics.
He's artificially generating all the physical cues of a dedicated team member. But then we hit the climax of the ordeal.
Oh, no.
The presenter stops, looks directly at the camera, and says, Dan, what do you think?
Literally the ultimate nightmare. You are suddenly in the spotlight of a company you do not even work for.
Asked to provide professional input.
Yes. Actionable input on sales numbers you learned existed roughly 6 minutes ago. I can just feel the sheer drop in my stomach just thinking about it.
The blood rushing to your ears. Most people would just completely shatter in that moment.
Totally.
The cognitive load of the lie would just become too heavy. They would start stammering, and the whole illusion would break.
But Dan delivers a response that we really need to dissect because he looks right back into the camera and calmly says, I think the overall direction makes sense.
It is brilliant.
I think the overall direction makes sense. I mean, it's basically corporate astrology.
Yes.
You can map absolutely any meaning onto that phrase, and the result. The entire room just nods thoughtfully, and the presenter just moves on.
It worked flawlessly.
But, I'm not fully convinced it's just about the phrasing. Confidence only goes so far, right?
Well,
Like, if they had asked him to explain the deficit in Q3, that generic sentence wouldn't have saved him. Isn't this just dumb luck that they asked an open-ended question?
I'd say it's a combination of luck, sure, but also a psychological phenomenon known as confirmation bias. And it's mixed with a linguistic mirror.
A linguistic mirror.
Yeah. You're right that a highly specific question would have unmasked him immediately. But human beings generally speak in ways that seek validation.
Oh, that makes sense.
When a presenter asks an open-ended question like, what do you think? They aren't usually looking for a granular teardown. They're just looking for a pulse check.
So when Dan says the overall direction makes sense, he's basically just giving them an empty vessel.
Precisely. Let's look at the actual mechanics of that sentence.
Okay.
Overall implies he has synthesized the micro details and is thinking macro, which sounds very authoritative.
Right.
Direction implies forward momentum without actually committing to any specific steps.
Wow. Yes.
And makes sense provides that validation the presenter is craving. So if the sales numbers were terrible, the presenter hears, your plan to fix this makes sense.
And if the numbers were great, they hear, keeping our current strategy makes sense.
Exactly. The listeners do all the cognitive work of filling in the blanks. Dan just provided the mirror.
So they projected their own context right onto his vague statement.
He did.
Because nobody in that room is operating under the assumption that a total stranger infiltrated their network. Their brains are not wired to expect that level of absurdity.
No, they are operating within the established reality of their workplace.
So they just think, good input, Dan. It's incredible.
And this brings us to the most crucial element of this whole thing. The perception of authority is derived entirely from calm.
Because Dan didn't panic externally?
Right. Because he didn't show panic, the room granted him authority.
But of course, because it's Dan, he pushes his luck.
Oh, absolutely.
He survives the initial questioning, he gets completely comfortable in his new role as an accidental consultant, and he basically decides to just live there. He stays in the meeting for another 10 minutes.
Which is astonishing. Surviving that first question should have triggered a graceful exit.
Right. Fake a bad internet connection, close the laptop, and literally never look back.
But the psychological relief of getting away with the lie actually reduced his perceived threat level. His amygdala finally calmed down, and he just hung out.
Until the inevitable unmasking.
Right. The disguise finally slips.
Somebody else in the meeting squints at the screen, interrupts the whole flow, and asks, wait, which team are you on again?
The generic consultant routine hits its structural limit.
Yep. The illusion breaks. Dan realizes the game is completely over, and he finally admits the truth.
He confesses that he clicked the wrong link.
He tells them he doesn't work for their company, and he has absolutely no idea what they've been talking about this whole time.
Now, just think about the dynamics of that room for a second.
Oh my gosh.
You have just spent 20 minutes sharing sensitive corporate strategies with a random guy off the internet. You even asked for his professional opinion.
Logically, the reaction should be absolute panic or anger. Someone should be contacting IT security immediately. But what actually happens, the entire grid of executives just burst into laughter.
It is such a wonderfully human reaction.
It really is.
The sudden, absurd juxtaposition of the reality they thought they were in versus the reality they were actually in, it causes all that tension to completely snap. Laughter is basically just a neurological release valve for sudden cognitive dissonance.
And the cherry on top of all of this is that amidst all this laughter, one of the people in the meeting looks at Dan and genuinely compliments him.
Yeah.
To say, honestly, you had some good points.
Which is so funny because he provided absolutely zero substantive value.
None.
But because he provided it with unbothered confidence, the emotional resonance of his good points lingered even after the facts were debunked.
So having delivered his imaginary value, Dan finally signs off. But the way he justified this to us later is essentially a masterclass in behavioral cues.
It really is.
When we asked him why he didn't just apologize and leave at minute one, he just shrugged and said, nobody seemed concerned.
That phrase is the skeleton key to this entire psychological event. Nobody seemed concerned.
I mean, of course they weren't concerned. They thought he was on the payroll.
Right.
They had zero reason to be concerned until he told them. But Dan was using their lack of panic as his own behavioral anchor.
Exactly. It's a feedback loop of social proof. Dan looks to the room for cues. The room appears calm, so Dan assumes his presence isn't causing a disruption.
And meanwhile, the room looks to Dan for cues.
Right. Dan appears perfectly calm and unbothered, so the room assumes he has the authority and the right to be there. People rarely interrogate someone who looks like they know exactly where they are going.
It's like if you walk into a building carrying a clipboard and looking slightly annoyed, nobody stops you.
No, they get out of your way.
You could walk right into a secure area. Dan was essentially doing the digital equivalent of carrying a clipboard.
He was entirely insulated by his own external presentation. And that transition from an internal state of chaos to an external state of calm, that's where we can extract some really practical tools for our listeners.
Definitely. Because Dan's entire 20-minute ordeal really boils down to 3 distinct phases of human emotion, or just vocabulary concepts: to notice, to panic, and to belong.
Let's look at how he navigated those and how they apply to the friction we face in our own lives.
Okay, let's start with the first phase. To notice, meaning to become aware of something. That terrible split-second realization where the illusion breaks.
For Dan, it was the instant awareness that he was surrounded by strangers.
Right. And what's fascinating about noticing things in a social context is the gap in perception. Dan noticed his error immediately, but the collective awareness of a room of 15 professionals was entirely dormant for 20 minutes.
It just proves how heavily we rely on context over active observation. We don't notice what we aren't primed to look for.
Wow, yeah.
And while the room failed to notice, Dan was instantly plunged into the second phase, to panic.
To suddenly feel extreme stress, that internal fight-or-flight adrenaline spike. When he was called on to give his opinion, his internal reality was pure panic.
Absolute chaos.
But I want you, listening right now, to really think about that feeling. Think about the last time you panicked internally, while externally you just nodded and offered a generic smile.
Well, do it.
Maybe you were in a complex financial meeting or sitting in a university lecture where you just completely lost the thread of the argument. You are silently terrified that someone is going to call on you and expose your lack of knowledge.
You were experiencing a very common phenomena, imposter syndrome. It's that crushing internal panic that you don't actually deserve your seat at the table, even when you are highly qualified and formally invited.
Right. But Dan's situation is the inverse of that.
Exactly, because Dan was a literal, actual imposter.
He had 0 qualifications. He wasn't invited.
He bypassed imposter syndrome entirely because he managed to artificially manufacture the third phase, to belong.
Meaning fitting naturally somewhere.
He weaponized confidence to create a sense of belonging out of thin air. Belonging in a social dynamic isn't always about having the right credentials or knowing the secret handshake.
Right.
Often, it is purely about the absence of outward panic. Because Dan didn't broadcast his internal chaos, the room naturally absorbed him into their ecosystem. He looked and sounded like he belonged, so reality simply bent to accommodate him.
It really puts our own daily anxieties into perspective, doesn't it?
It really does.
If Dan can seamlessly belong in a high-level corporate strategy meeting for a company he doesn't even work for, simply by keeping his cool and offering a vague platitude, then you can absolutely belong in the rooms you actually earned your way into.
The threshold for social acceptance is so much lower than our anxiety tells us it is. We spend so much energy worrying that we will be exposed for not knowing every single detail.
When in reality, the people around us are usually just looking for a nod of validation.
It's true.
So the lesson here isn't that we should all go out and start crashing random meetings.
No, please don't do that.
The lesson is that blending in and surviving high-pressure moments isn't about having a flawless command of the facts. It is about emotional regulation. It is about swallowing that sudden spike of panic, trusting that people are generally taking you at face value, and confidently agreeing that the overall direction makes sense.
It's a remarkably effective survival tactic.
It is. And we want to challenge you to put some of the mechanics of this story into practice this week. Your challenge is to focus on that first phase, the act of noticing.
Try to deliberately break your own autopilot. When we operate on routine, like Dan just clicking his meeting links without looking, we miss the granular details of our environment.
Right.
This week, try to actively notice something interesting that your brain would normally filter out. Maybe a quirky detail in a colleague's background, a pattern in how people speak in meetings, or just a small moment in your commute.
And then share it. Tell someone, I noticed something interesting today.
Practice pulling yourself out of the blur of the schedule.
And hey, maybe you'll notice someone in your next meeting who has been quiet for an unusually long time, and you can wonder if they accidentally pulled a Dan.
Keep an eye out for the imposters.
Speaking of noticing bizarre details in our friends' lives, I want to give you a quick sneak peek at what we'll be discussing on our next episode.
Oh man, I'm already laughing just thinking about it.
We are going to be dissecting the mind of our friend Lily. So Lily recently decided to overhaul her life and get incredibly organized.
Very ambitious.
She created a master color-coded study and life plan, which sounds highly functional, right? Until you actually look at it.
It is wild.
Absolutely nobody on Earth understands the logic behind her colors except for Lily. It is a staggering masterpiece of confusing organization.
I have stared at it for hours trying to reverse engineer the logic. I am still trying to understand why Tuesday is a soft neon green, while Thursday is a highly aggressive, almost violent shade of purple.
It makes zero logical sense to the outside observer, but to her, it is a perfectly tuned system.
I can't wait to get into that.
We're going to explore the psychology of personalized systems and the absolute chaos of Lily's highlighters next time. But for now, as we wrap up the legendary tale of Dan the Accidental Consultant, we want to leave you with a final thought.
A question to carry with you as you navigate the rest of your week. Think about the spaces you move through every single day.
The offices, the Zoom grids, the lecture halls, the social gatherings.
Think about the authority you automatically grant to the people sitting quietly in those spaces.
Exactly. In your own life, whether you are presenting a big project at work, sitting in a crowded classroom, or just trying to navigate a complicated social event, how often are the people around you just accidentally in the wrong room, quietly panicking, nodding along, and desperately hoping someone tells them their overall direction makes sense?